Welcome to this ELF workshop where we're tackling the question of Jesus and the failures of the church. I'm Andy Bannister, the Director of the Solas Centre for Public Christianity, based in Scotland and in Dundee, a town about an hour north of Edinburgh. And I'm an evangelist and an apologist, spend about half my time in very much secular settings, doing evangelistic events in everything from universities to pubs to cafes to coffee shops and restaurants and business settings, and the other half teaching and training Christians how to share our faith in a way that engages people. And the topic we're looking at tonight is a big one. It's a pretty important one, actually, because I get this question a lot from people. There are different versions of it. There are tougher versions of it and milder versions of it. But certainly one of the mild versions I often hear is people who say words to the effect of, I'm impressed by Jesus, quite drawn to Jesus. I'm willing to take a look at him, but just a moment. What about the church? What about the legacy of the church and some of the things that have been done in the name of the church and of Christianity throughout history? And this question comes up a lot. I think it's very much a contemporary question, and so that's what we're looking at this evening. Well, let me turn the screen share on so I can share my slide deck with you. And I mentioned again just a few moments ago, for those of you who didn't catch it, if you want the slide deck with the quotes and the various bits and pieces that are in there, if you go to my website, andybannister.net/ELF 2020, you can pull down all the resources for this particular workshop there as a PDF, all free of charge for you, and that will give you all the quotes and other bits and pieces. But without further ado, let's move on, and we'll do about half an hour of content, and then we'll do some Q&A. And to kind of set the scene for where I want to go over the next half an hour or so, I want to begin by taking us back in history, taking us back almost 1,000 years. And the location is Jerusalem. The date is the 15th of July, 1099. And the previous night, the Crusader armies that had been besieging the city walls finally broke through, and 10,000 heavily armed crusaders fought their way up to the Dome of the Rock, one of the holiest sites in Islam. There, the Crusader armies broke into the Temple Mount area where many civilians had been sheltering and had sought refuge. And what followed is, according to some historians, probably one of the bloodiest episodes in the history of the church, because those crusaders killed thousands, not just men and soldiers. They also killed women and children and the elderly. And they didn't just do the killing, actually, they rejoiced and they celebrated their killing. One contemporary chronicler, Raymond of Argulier, describing the slaughter, tells us this. He says, piles of heads and hands and feet were to be seen in the streets of the city. Men rode in blood up to their knees. Indeed, it was a just and splendid judgment of God that this place should be filled with the blood of the unbelievers. This day will be famous throughout all generations, for it turned our labors and our sorrows into joy and exultation. This day, I say, marks the justification of all Christianity. Now, that would be bad enough, but things get worse, because after the slaughter, the Crusaders, or pilgrims, as they like to designate themselves, marched to the nearby Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where they held a thanksgiving service for their victory. And of course, the irony and the hypocrisy are unbelievable. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre there in Jerusalem was built over the traditional site of Jesus' tomb, the place where Jesus' body had been laid after his death on a Roman cross some 1,000 years before. The Jesus who was famous for his radical non-violence, the Jesus who had preached, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, the Jesus who had said, do to others as you would have them do unto you, the Jesus who, even while being crucified, had forgiven his murderers. Now, of course, there were complex reasons for the Crusades. A lot of the Crusades and the fighting in the Crusades were not for religious reasons. They were primarily political reasons. And in fact, the massive 3-volume Encyclopedia of Wars, which documents 1,763 wars between 8000 BC and AD 2003, categorizes just 123 conflicts in the whole of recorded history as religious. That's less than 7% in 10,000 years of history. But however much we try and justify it or explain it away, nevertheless, the church had allowed herself to become co-opted by the state, and there were tragic consequences. Now, if only the problem of religion and violence was back there in history, but it hasn't gone away. Throughout history, there have been sadly other times when the church and those bearing the name Christian have fallen terribly short of the ideals and the ethics of Jesus. For example, in the 20th century, in Nazi Germany, many Christians failed to stand up to the Third Reich and to Hitler. Rather than resist the Nazis, many Christian leaders, many church leaders cozied up to power and capitulated or turned a blind eye rather than risk their lives to take a stand. And there are even more recent examples of the church's somewhat checkered history. Northern Ireland, part of the UK, has been a place marked in recent years by religious violence. Beginning in 1968, the so-called Troubles, as they were termed, saw 30 years of sectarian violence. On the one side were Protestant loyalists who wanted Northern Ireland to remain part of Britain. On the other side, you had Catholic nationalists who wanted to have the province rejoin the Republic of Ireland, which had won its independence in 1921. And for 3 decades, I can remember as a young person growing up during this era of history, and for 3 decades, Northern Ireland was ripped apart by sectarian violence, beatings and shootings and bombings, with that violence often spilling over into the mainland UK. I can remember as a child, you were drummed into you things like, things to look out for, be wary of certain things, be careful about places like railway stations and so forth, which were often targeted by the terrorists. And perhaps the worst atrocity during the 30 years of the Troubles occurred on the 8th of November, 1987, when a nationalist bomb exploded in the small town of Enniskillen during a Remembrance Day Sunday parade. 11 people killed, mostly civilians. Now, the Troubles came to an end on Good Friday, 1998, when the major parties on both sides of the conflict reached a peace agreement. But even today, if you visit Belfast, the capital of Northern Ireland, you can still see these massive so-called peace walls, they're known as, dividing key Protestant and Catholic parts of the city. I remember actually speaking in Belfast 2 years ago at an evangelistic event held at a community centre on the Falls Road, which had been a key battleground during the Troubles. And as I walked past those huge security fences that you see there on that slide, I confess I actually wanted to weep. I found myself asking, how can it possibly be in the 21st century in Northern Ireland, in part of the UK, that communities can be so divided, that people on both sides who would claim the label Christian, how can they so hate one another? And quite simply, I'm utterly ashamed of it, utterly ashamed and heartbroken that the message of Jesus has ever, even remotely in any way, ever been associated with hatred or a sword or violence or a gun or a bomb. And one of the main reasons, of course, I'm ashamed of it is it's such a travesty of the teaching of Jesus. Quite simply, no other figure in history was more scathing or more critical about the use of violence in the name of religion than Jesus. Love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, he said. If someone strikes you, turn the other cheek. And for 300 years, the early Christians did a remarkably good job, a stunningly good job of living up to the teaching of Jesus. All the more remarkable because during those first 300 years, the Roman imperial powers heavily persecuted the Christian church, labeling the early Christians atheists, would you believe, because they denied the Roman gods. The Emperor Nero, one of the most vicious of Roman tyrants, was fond of brutally persecuting the Christian church and torturing Christians. One of his favorite ideas, favorite tricks, was to tie Christian men and women to posts and set them alight, cover them in tar and set them alight at his garden parties to entertain his guests. Meanwhile, Christians were torn apart by wild animals and hacked to pieces by gladiators in places like the Colosseum there in Rome. Yet faced with that violence, the early church and the early Christians responded consistently with compassion and consistently with love, living out their master's words to respond to violence, not with violence, but with love. To give you just one example, in AD 107, whilst himself on his way to be executed and martyred in Rome, Ignatius, the Bishop of Antioch, a key leader in the very early church, wrote a letter to Christians in the Roman colony of Ephesus. And in that letter, this is what he wrote. He said, in response to their anger, be gentle. In response to their boasts, be humble. And in response to their cruelty, be civilized. Do not be eager to imitate them. Let us show by our gracious forbearance that we are their brothers and sisters. Let us be eager to be imitators of the Lord. And from the early church down through the ages, there have been Christians, there have been men and women, followers of Christ, who have sought consistently and faithfully, often at great personal cost, to follow the message and teaching of Jesus. Just one example among many. Take someone like Martin Luther King, key leader in the American civil rights movement, and a flawed individual like many of us, but also a committed Christian. And on the 28th of August, 1963, on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, there in Washington, D.C., he spoke to 250,000 people, largely African Americans, who had gathered there in the national capital of the USA to demand equal rights for African Americans. And he gave his incredibly famous speech, one of the most famous political speeches in the last 100 years, his famous I Have a Dream speech. I have a dream, said King, that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. I have a dream that I have a dream today. One day, right there in Alabama, little black boys and little black girls will one day be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as brothers and sisters. I have a dream today. And in that speech, that incredibly famous piece of oratory, King quoted the Bible many times. I often have this conversation with secular friends and humanist friends who love that speech, but I point out the number of biblical references woven into it. For example, in that speech, King said, we will not be satisfied until justice rolls like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. A direct quote from Amos 5 and verse 24. And King's Christian faith shaped his whole approach to justice, but especially his commitment to non-violence, which he believed was the way of Jesus. On the 30th of January, 1956, his home was firebombed while his wife and baby daughter were inside. Thankfully, the family were unhurt, but the event so enraged his supporters that a massive mob of them gathered outside his home, demanding vengeance, wanting to march and take revenge on those who had done this to Martin Luther King and his family. Martin Luther King stepped out of the burnt remains of his house, looked at the crowds, and told them to go home. He urged them to love their enemies, not to take revenge, and he implored them to follow the example of Jesus and to respond not with hatred, but with love. Well, there are other examples we could point to from history too. Another hugely positive impact of the church in history has been the impact of missionaries. And this is a fascinating one because there are a lot of myths about missionaries. A lot of my secular friends have heard all kinds of myths about how missionaries were, terrible people, the damage they wrought to traditional societies and so on and so forth. But like so many myths, those are largely wrong. In 2010, the sociologist Robert Woodbury published the results of a long-term major study looking at the impact of those missionaries who had preached for conversion. In other words, missionaries who are not acting as agents of the state or of the colonial powers, but missionaries who genuinely believed in the gospel and preached the message and love of Jesus, looking for conversion, not for political expansion. And Woodbury's research, which has now been confirmed by over a dozen other studies, showed that the legacy of such missionaries in history has been dramatic. Summing up his research in one article, Robert Woodbury writes these words. He said, areas where Protestant missionaries had a significant presence in the past are on average more economically developed today, with comparatively better health, lower infant mortality, lower corruption, greater literacy, higher educational attainment, especially for women, and more robust membership in non-governmental societies. Furthermore, in places where, as he calls them, conversionary Protestants were active in the past, you will typically find more printed books and more schools, while in Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Asia, many of those leaders who successfully led their countries to independence had all graduated from Protestant missionary schools. Just to give you one example of many we could quote, the lady in that slightly grainy photograph there on the slide that I'm sharing with you is Eliza Bridgman. And in 1844, Eliza went to China as a missionary. And 20 years later, she opened a school in Beijing for girls who would otherwise have been forced into the sex trade or simply left to starve. Her school eventually became part of Yenching University, which one of China's first universities, and that in time became Peking University, now China's most prestigious university. And it tickles me somewhat that a very secular communist country like China, its preeminent educational institution there in the capital city, has its roots in a Protestant missionary school. And the conclusion of all this, my friends, is that we look back through history, we see that the church has a mixed record. There are examples of terrible atrocities and failures when Christians failed to live up to the message of Jesus, but then there's tremendous impact and a huge force for good. So that raises the question, how do we judge? How do we judge? I say this to my secular friends, or to us as Christians, do we just pick the bits we like and ignore the bits we don't? Or do our secular friends reverse it, ignore the bits that are good and just beat Christians over the head with the bad bits? How do we judge the church and its somewhat mixed record? Well, some friends of mine in Australia, at the Centre for Public Christianity, about a couple of years ago, produced a wonderful documentary there in Australia called For the Love of God, which looks at the church in history and covers some of the ground that we've covered tonight. And they use a very, very helpful analogy that I want to borrow from the documentary, as I think we try and pull the threads together and think our way through this. In the documentary, they give this example. They say, consider a famous piece of classical music. Consider, for example, Bach's cello suites. Absolutely beautiful piece of classical music. Now, you could do a couple of things at this point. You could listen to a world-class cellist, such as the Chinese-American maestro Yo-Yo Ma, arguably one of the most gifted musicians in the world, and certainly one of the best cellists in the world. You could listen to him play that piece of music absolutely beautifully. Or you could listen to me, who is tone deaf, musically illiterate, and hasn't actually picked up a cello for 30 years. I did it for a couple of years when I was at high school, and the cello and I did not agree with each other. Here's the question. How would you best judge the quality of Bach's cello suites itself? Presumably, you can only judge the quality of the piece of music when it's played properly and authentically as its composer actually intended. If you listened to me massacre it and you walked away and you went, Bach couldn't write music for toffee, you would have drawn the wrong conclusion. It's my fault. I performed it badly. On the other hand, if you listen to Yo-Yo Ma play it and you go, what an incredibly beautiful piece of music, you'd be right, because he's represented the author's intent, the composer's intent. And I want to suggest to you something similar, I think, is going on when we look at Jesus and the church. You know, you can't truly assess the church. You can't truly assess the message of the church and Christianity and the gospel unless we ask, what does it look like when people have faithfully tried to live Jesus' message out, especially maybe even at great personal cost? Absolutely, there have been bad performances in history. But just as with Bach's piece of music there, we need to look to the best performances, the authentic performances that we want to encourage our friends to look if you want to see what Jesus' message actually looks like in practice. Now, that's a helpful approach. But there is one weakness. There is still one problem. And the problem is, if we're not careful, that has a tendency to reduce Christianity to a code of ethics. It seems to suggest that all we have to do is work harder. We need to work harder to follow Jesus' ethic, to try really hard to love our neighbors, to try really hard to love our enemies, to try really hard to show compassion. And if we were just more moral and we worked harder and did better, the world would be a better place. But of course, the problem is that we struggle as human beings to live up to codes of ethics. If we're honest with ourselves, we struggle to live up to our own standards, let alone Jesus's. And it gets worse if we manage to live up to our standards. If we do succeed, we have a very human tendency to puff ourselves up with pride and then begin looking down on others who don't measure up to us. And you see, human beings have this terrible tendency to exclude others and a nasty habit of co-opting religion, politics, and even ethics into this. For example, the Spanish Inquisition saw 6,000 people killed in 350 years. Another example of where the church perhaps has not been at its greatest. But that pales into insignificance compared to the French Revolution, the secular French Revolution. That saw 18,000 people killed in 9 months. Or we might look at Stalin's avowedly communist, atheist Russia. That killed 20 million people in 30 years. Stalin managed 2 Spanish Inquisitions every week for 30 years. My point here is not that secular people are more violent than religious people. Never try that as an apologetic. Never say to your secular friends, hey, the church has been bad, but at least we're not as bad as the atheists. That's not a helpful apologetic. But my bigger point is that the real problem is human beings. We have this ability to be brutal, mean, vicious, and vindictive. And if we think we are holier or nicer or cleverer or more rational or more moral than others, we are especially dangerous because we tend to oppress those who don't measure up. What's the solution? Well, in closing, what we need is a basis for humility. We need a basis for something that undercuts our tendency to think too well of ourselves and to look down on others. And of course, this is one of the basic problems with religion. Many people think that religion is all about being good, moral, righteous, and so on and so forth, but that very quickly leads to looking down on others. And it doesn't matter what religion you point to, including atheism, which I put in this category as well, it all leads to a tendency to look down on other people, start judging them, and then the problems begin. There's only one exception, of course, to this pattern, and that's Jesus and the radical message he taught. The message of Jesus is not try and be a good person, because that way you'll be more decent. Jesus' message certainly wasn't, as we know, live up to these incredibly high standards and God will like you. Rather, Jesus' radical and deeply humbling message is that human beings, you and I, are also badly messed up and mixed up that we don't have the ability to live morally without inner transformation. And as we know the gospel, the only way to get that is by accepting what Jesus did when he paid for our brokenness, our mess ups, our violence on the cross, taking that punishment we deserved into himself as he was punished for our self-centeredness, arrogance, and pride. I'm so grateful that Jesus doesn't just exhort us to live up to his message of radical non-violence and justice. Jesus first offers to put right our own lives, and then gives us the power to live differently, the power to respond to violence with forgiveness. One last story in conclusion, and then we'll have some Q&A. The lady on the screen share here is Corrie ten Boom. Some of you may know her story, others of you may not. She's not so well known today as she once was. And her story is fascinating, though. In 1939, Corrie ten Boom lived with her father and her sister in the Netherlands, where her father ran a watchmaker's shop. Holland fell to the Nazis in 1940, and soon attacks on Jews became commonplace. Or committed Christians, Corrie and her family began, like others did, helping hide Jewish people in their home and then smuggle them out of the country. And many were rescued. And they did that for several years, but in 1944, disaster struck. They were discovered and the family quickly arrested by the Gestapo. Corrie's father died very quickly, but Corrie and her sister Betsy were shipped off to Ravensbrück concentration camp, a camp specially built for women prisoners. And there they suffered terrible atrocities and abuse, and her sister Betsy eventually died an agonizing death. Corrie, however, survived, was eventually released, and began a post-war career as an evangelist, traveling across Europe and further afield, talking about God's love. But then one day, something truly shocking happened to her. Let me quote you her own words from her autobiography. She writes, "It was at a church service in Munich that I saw him. The former SS man who had stood guard at the shower room door in the processing centre at Ravensbrück. He was the first of our actual jailers I had seen since that time, and suddenly it was all there. The room full of mocking men, the heaps of clothing, Betsy's pain-blanched face. He came up to me as the church was emptying, beaming and bowing. "How grateful I am for your message, Fraulein," he said. "To think that as you preached, Jesus has washed my sins away." His hand was thrust out to shake mine. I tried to smile. I struggled to raise my hand, and I could not. I felt nothing, not the slightest spark of warmth or charity. And so again, I breathed a silent prayer. "Jesus, I cannot forgive him. Give me your forgiveness." As I took his hand, the most incredible thing happened. From my shoulder, along my arm, and through my hand, a current seemed to pass from me to him, while into my heart sprang a love for this stranger that almost overwhelmed me. And so I discovered that it is not on our forgiveness any more than on our goodness that the world's healing hinges, but on Christ's. To which I can only say, with Corrie ten Boom, I completely agree with her.